AI has been the buzzword of 2024, but also 2023. For this video, I want to cover more of an emerging topic that is coming up in circles as most organizations are adopting some form of generative AI. Whether that be a SaaS application you're considering, such as Enterprise, ChatGPT, Microsoft 365, Copilot, or beyond that, perhaps you're thinking about using Google Gemini inside your enterprise. It's important to note what is going on from the security perspective as these components are starting to expand in our environments. So I want to cover this emerging topic of AI security posture management. I know it's a lot to take in, given cybersecurity broadly loves acronyms, it appears. But at a high level, I try to distill these topics down that are more consumable for the end user, but also practitioners in this space. So broadly, when we think about AI security posture management, I covered current players that I could find from an arbitrary search. I'm pretty sure there's more out there. So if your company or vendor did not make this list, forgive me from that perspective. But we want to think about there's many components that make up a generative AI application. So typically the frontier models that are known as closed source from that perspective, or even open source, Llama 3 that just came out recently. If you are going to use these types of models inside your application, it's likely these are going to encompass some form of code and other packages related to that. Now, how you containerize that, or if you containerize that, most of the time that's still going to have some type of artifact. And that really goes to the bill of materials, the components that make up our generative AI application, okay? So you'll hear bill of materials from a software supply chain perspective. We call these model cards or ML, machine learning bill of materials, because there's various components that make up a machine learning model or a frontier model from that perspective as well. Now, broadly, if you are evaluating the security posture management, you need to understand the context of what am I exposed to, and that's really what attack paths are noted inside this visual here. So attack paths you want to think about broadly are, okay, so based on the recommendations that are surfaced from this specific type of tool, how can this specific finding impact my environment, right? So if a risk does exist, how critical is it? Now, this also goes into the importance of understanding your critical assets that you do have deployed, right? So that's going to go into your asset inventory as well. And ideally, you'll tag these with some form of criticality to your business, right? So if it's a front-facing production application, many of your users, let's say, use a chatbot of some sort, in that indirectly touches some form of generative AI from that perspective. And let's say there was a component that has some type of risk, right? So then we have some other external risk factors that we need to consider as well, but we have to understand that attack path. How can it be leveraged inside our environment? And what's the impact of that? Now, broadly, you'll see continuous monitoring. This doesn't really change when we think about cloud security posture management. What's really shifting with AI security posture management, there's a lot more components, if you will, that can live outside of the traditional hyperscaler platform, if you will. So for instance, perhaps maybe you're using AWS Bedrock, but you're also using Azure AI Studio for difference of whatever the product parity is, whatever the case may be. And maybe you like Amazon Bedrock's direct access to Anthropic, right? Maybe you like Azure OpenAI's access that is direct, typically first for specific models, things of that nature. Well, the monitoring of that's going to definitely broaden that scope, if you will. So you need to understand that when you deploy from a platform as a service, and that's typically consuming the model with some form of an API key, right? How are we monitoring for abuse, sensitive material that could be detrimental to the reputation? That's really where continuous monitoring is going to come in play. Now, it's important to note that from what I could surface right now, I'll cover what are the current players and show you some components of the bill of materials, if you will, using Hugging Face. So the current players that I saw right now, Defender for Cloud in Azure has a preview of using AI security posture management with detections out of the box. as well, in addition to some of the content safety as well. There's Wiz.io. It's likely you've heard of Wiz in some shape or form. They've introduced AI security posture management, a part of their platform, along with Orca Security. I did come across the Protect AI. The specific product they are calling their posture management is known as Radar. Pretty similar types of features, components, but these are the 4 core components you want to think about. Now, obviously there's going to be inventory, right? You need to obviously have some point of, I can't protect what I am unaware of, right? So I need to have some form of inventory of the applications that I have deployed that are accessing a generative AI model in some shape or form. Broadly, we also want to think about this left-hand side. I put a note. If you're building from platform as a service, right, these models are hosted in a form of a marketplace that you're consuming, and you're paying that underlying hyperscaler, whether that's AWS, Google Cloud, or Azure, for use of that hosted model, right? So this is typically a serverless API deployment. Obviously, there's servers in the background, but you are consuming that based on a token basis. So the amount of tokens is what you're charged typically in pay-as-you-go, unless you're doing some reservations of some sorts. So it's important to note, similar to any type of marketplace, whether that's on your phone or whether that's in a ecosystem, you have to, make sure that what you are consuming is vetted in some shape or form. Azure specifically partnered with a organization called Hidden Layer for validation of specific models. So if you see Hidden Layer inside the Azure AI Studio, that will let you know as well that that specific model has been validated. But broadly, anything that you see that is hosted on these types of platforms have some type of vetting before they are in some form of a marketplace. Now, I'm not going to say Hugging Face isn't a great platform. It is, but it is a large type of GitHub, if you will, repository with many models. It's really the machine learning repository for most of open source components. So if you are consuming from Hugging Face directly, they do have some safeguards in place, but things to just be aware of, okay? Now, when we think broadly of the components that play into the larger picture, so obviously a model has to be trained on certain subsets of data. If you are building from the ground up, you are in control of what data is actually being trained, or if you are fine-tuning specific models that you're trying to direct a domain of expertise in, that will be that fine-tuning portion of it. But we also need to understand if we are leveraging any of these models, whether we're using a RAG pattern, what type of data that it does have access to, and is it sensitive to our organization, right? Broadly, you want to think about anything that it does have access to. Have we tested this thoroughly to ensure that there's not indirect attacks that could expose any of that data? And then we also have to think back to that model integrity, and that really goes into the bill of materials. How are we validating specifically that what we are consuming is genuine in nature and it hasn't been tampered with by a man in the middle or any type of alteration to the artifacts before it's been produced, right? So that's really going to lead back into inventory. What existing applications do I have? And then lastly, we're always going to need to understand the level of access to these AI models in general. You likely have heard of denial of wallet, right? So if I do have a front-facing application that is typically consuming API tokens in some shape or form, whether, let's say, a user logs in with a password, MFA, whatever the case may be, and they get assigned a specific user ID, are there specific parameters in place to that access of that model, i.e. rate limiting? The reason why I say this is because you are charged on a pay-as-you-go basis, right? If that end user doesn't really have any form of rate limiting or any type of parameters that constrains that user, these are some things that you're going to have to start thinking about broadly, okay? Because the costs do add up when you're using generative AI. So just wanted to put this on your map here. I'm going to go through a specific model that I came across on the Azure AI Studio that is hosted on Hugging Face to show you more about a bill of materials. So if you see on my screen now, I switched over tabs. This will show the Hugging Face, right? So you can search specific models. You can see they have data sets, organizations, right? And then spaces as well. Now, this is really similar to GitHub if you use GitHub commonly, but you'll notice right when I click on a specific model, you have essentially a user, if you will, then this specific repository almost of what that user has created. So this looks like a Llama 3 specific model, and you'll see there is a annotation called model card. Now this model card will tell you quite a lot of information about this. This model is a fine-tune of Meta Llama 3. This fine-tune model was previously known. It will give you essentially what was its last known, typically in versioning. It's been renamed. Now you'll also see how it's essentially a part of the OpenLLM leaderboards, but essentially this is breaking down components, if you will, or the transparency of what's a part of this model. This will also tell you how to use, similar to documentation, if you will. Now you'll see here on the evaluation results to the right-hand side, this will tell you for accuracy and other specific evaluations. And then I can obviously expand that view on papers with code. And then I can look at what are the collections, the data set used to train. This will tell you that specific data set, and then fine tune from essentially that frontier model, if you will, okay? This will tell you essentially how many downloads have happened. So similar to GitHub, or in this case, really Docker Hub. If you can see specific models, you want to think of them also kind of as container images or in this specific interface similar to that. This is going to let you know the popularity of it. Now you can also go through the actual underlying files and versions. So you can see here how the files are composed. And then you can also see community for anything as far as discussions, things of that nature, okay? And then you can see you can use the model along with how to use the model itself. So that's just one specific area. Now I wanted to point out a couple players that I did talk about. Hidden Layer specifically. I've come across Hidden Layer partly because they were partnered with Microsoft's Azure AI Studio. But this essentially will show you an AI security platform I've come across. And again, I haven't tested this to let you know all the efficacy of it, but you'll see specifically, let me see if they show a visual here, and I'll zoom in a little bit. So you can see here, this will be essentially your model inventory that we spoke about, but they have a similar platform that just focuses directly on AI security, okay? Now, I also would be remiss if I didn't show some form of what Wiz.io has put out as well. They essentially have some of the components I covered, their inventory management. You can kind of see what that looks like. I'll zoom in a little bit. And this essentially, think about this as a catalog, right? As you're consuming these specific models, and this will map your specific usage, right? And then has this been reviewed, not reviewed? And then what type of service it is, right? A cloud platform service from that perspective, okay? So important to note as well, you also have the components when we go back here, when you are consuming from a specific platform as a service, right? When we're talking about the perspective of AWS Bedrock or an Azure AI Studio facilitating some form of large language model operations in some shape or form, right? You likely always will have some portion of some type of guardrail of content filtering, if you will. And I use this term broadly, content filtering. You want to think about this as when your prompt is sent to the API, this will go through essentially like an interceptor. This is going to check if your specific prompt is malicious, hateful, whatever the case may be. Now, there's also other terms that vendors will use, such as block lists, things like that. Now, if it passes those checks, right, then it will get a response back. Let's say it doesn't, and that's essentially when you'll see a response that's typically rejected. You're violating XYZ policies, things like that. And that's really what's going to rely on the last component here. When we talk about continuous monitoring, right? So when we think about when we do deploy any of these services, right, long term, whether they're internal applications that are used to help out for productivity, how are we going to monitor that, right? Because we want to be aware if our models are being tampered with any shape or form, and that's really the large overarching concept of AI security posture management. Now, broadly, this will likely gradually change in general as far as the scope of this. This is a fast-moving type of area, but a lot of things are fairly similar when we're thinking about security posture management from the context of how can I trust what I am doing is the most secure way. That's the way I like to think about it. Similar to how you have a fitness watch, right? A fitness watch measures your specific heart rates, things of that nature, whether it's your food intake, and you need to be aware of what you're doing from a diet perspective so you're not gaining weight or whatever the case may be. You want to think about, as you're consuming these services, what is put in place to actually give us visibility from the inventory side, but also from the risk perspective as well to our organization. The substantial amount of use of generative AI is always going to tie back into the reputational damage if it is misused and abused for public-facing types of applications as well. So a lot of risk, but you also have to think about how are we going to monitor that risk and manage that risk. And that's really the intention of AI security posture management. So hopefully you learned a little concept. I try to keep these short, up to 10 minutes. If this was helpful in any shape or form, feel free to like this video, share it, subscribe, and I will cover more topics such as this.